Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for braving the weather to come here today. My name is Brian Holcomb. I'm the curator at the Moss Arts Center, and we're here to welcome David Ayala-Alfonso, who's our visiting curator for our current exhibition, Never Spoken Again, Rogue Stories of Science and Collections. David is a curator, writer, and researcher living and working in Mexico City. He's the guest curator for the Independent Curators International, who helped organize this traveling exhibition. He's a visiting critic for the Ford Family Foundation and for At the Transit Bar series in Toronto, a mentor for different residency programs in Mexico City, an editor of the Journal of Visual Culture, and an author and advisor for a series of editorial projects in the US, Mexico, and the United Kingdom. Ayala-Alfonso has received various awards, including a Fulbright Grant, an ICI-Dedalus Award for Curatorial Research, a grant for Exploratory Research at SAIC, and he holds an MA in Visual and Critical Studies from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, a specialization in art education from the National University of Colombia, and has done different curatorial residencies in France, Colombia, the United States, United Kingdom, and Germany. So let's welcome David. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, so David's also been in residence at the university for 2 weeks now as we were installing at the, oh my goodness, I forgot. At the CID, which is the Creative Innovation District Residential Building. And he has been meeting with students in classes in the galleries for the past 2 weeks, and they've been having tours and getting to see behind the scenes all the way up to the last minute and everything with installing. So, David, I wanted to start off with, this is 17 artists in the show, a global show, and a lot of artists are kind of dealing with the archive, and I just kind of wanted to start off with what was the prompt for the show?
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for everybody for being here in this very lovely weather. So, as I have mentioned, I see a few familiar faces. I already mentioned to some of you that I've been working for a long time in this show, and I think the first ideas came from different experiences that I had in curatorial training of sorts. I don't have a degree in curating specifically, and it's not necessarily common that many curators have one. However, I've done a few residencies, and many of them are themed. And I think one of the things that was very compelling to me was the topic of a research residency program that I did in Germany in 2015, where I saw a study collection of desiccated parrots and birds. And it was obsolete because it was not created in like the proper taxidermy way that you would need to preserve the birds for actual scientific study. So they were there for aesthetic purposes, and one of them really stood out, which was Alexander von Humboldt's bird. And that bird has, these several fascinating stories of what it is or where it came from. But they are all speculations and gossip of sorts. They're scientific gossip that I think the people who are in the research that connect science, art, and curating are very fascinated about. However, these stories are never put in books. They're never put in official projects of any sort. That's not canonical language. That's kind of something that lives parallel to the actual histories that we write about science and curation. So I was very attracted to how these stories are decided to be part of science or not, are decided to create frameworks for the creation of a museum collection, for example, or a scientific collection, but also how they allow they kind of normalize or allow the emergence of extractive practices, and how they also create frameworks for justifying the existence of those heritage extractions in museum collections, and how these procedures kind of were created in the midst of many contingencies during colonial extraction. I'm thinking about a lot of what happened in late 17th century, 18th century, and I guess that's where the Humboldt story like really surfaced for me. And I use it as a rhetorical device for me to be able to create this very first stage of skepticism for everyone who sees the exhibition. But the story itself is just like there for the grabs. It's not necessarily deciding anything conceptual, but rather creating you know, an environment, an atmosphere for the spectators to see what's going to be in the show. Yeah.
And you also used this as one of the prompts for, I mean, this is a traveling show, so each venue had to locate a bird for the show that was relevant to the region or had some story. So what were, I mean, with the selection, we, for this show, we located the African gray parrot from the Natural History Museum in Martinsville, but you had like a choice between 3 or 4. So what prompted you to choose the one that's in our current show right now? But we're looking at the one that the Telfair Museum in Savannah. Yeah.
So that one that we're looking at, I think he's from the family of the yellow-headed parrots, tropical parrots that you often find in the scientific collections. And I think yellow-headed parrots and gray Africans are very common. And they have been even more so because they are mascots of predilection. Both birds are the ones that can mimic and reproduce human sounds the best. So what we think of as speech, I think the African parrot really stands out. And because I already had a few birds that were more resembling of that original parrot that was, you know, like the origin story for the exhibition, I was kind of like drawn to this African parrot because I think it's the one that it's deemed as more, I think, as more prone to develop speech skills and social skills with humans. And because of that, that's the most endangered species of them all. So I like this kind of fraught relationship between us, our desire for understanding what we call nature, and the way that we decide to approach it, usually creating a framework for the destruction of that very precious object of study or desire that we are looking into. So the more we like the birds, because the more we think they resemble us, the more we destroy them. And I think it's very important that the parrot, it's not the original parrot, because I'm also bringing forward this question of authenticity and the story itself. We don't really know the truth value of that story, so it really doesn't matter what kind of bird we have in the show. The bird is there just for creating the excuse to have that conversation. And as soon as you enter the exhibition space and you see that the bird is perfectly preserved, and you know that that's absolutely not what it should be, Humboldt's parrot, you already enter like in this state of skepticism. So that's what I want to bring about into the show.
And did that, I mean, all the artists in the show kind of use the archive as a medium? A lot of them are research-based, and as you shared during the week with the students, how a lot of your work is based in research, but one student asked the question, like, what is your favorite medium to curate? And in this show, it's a lot about each of these artifacts and the stories connected with them, as you said, with a certain amount of skepticism. You know, so how, I mean, with the commissioning the works, it's like, say with Sophia's works, I mean, what was the conversation like with her for why you selected this work for the show?
I think what you mentioned about the archives is I think it's an excellent talking point, and it also makes me think about my own work, because I think it also reveals something that I was kind of like halfway unaware of, in the sense that I remember myself thinking about archival exhibitions when they are created by many different curatorial practices that are usually library curators, historical curators, and so on. I often don't enjoy those exhibitions because I feel that they are very limited in the language that they put together for deploying an archive. However, these artists are doing an excellent job bringing the archive into new lives. So I think Sofia is a very good example of that, because she has been doing her research into species that have transformed the, I guess, the landscape of her home country, which is Chile, and how those stories also connect with extractive practices worldwide. So Chile was originally, like in colonial times, it was an extractive space. A lot of copper and coal mainly was extracted from the mines in Chile, and she developed this connection between the insertion of one species as means for assisting the extractive process, but also revealing how this species ends up transforming the cultural and economic and ecological landscapes of the country. So while she was doing that research, she was also visiting Colombia, and then she found this archival photo that is part of the work, kind of making a line between colonial extraction of mining goods, and then like all the way into how they help or assist creating infrastructures further on. So this is a helicopter putting a post, which was the original usage of eucalyptus. That was created in the Americas. It was for the purpose of laying out electrical wiring in mines, basically. And then it became kind of a common practice for the rest of the continent. And now we understand eucalyptus as a native species, or I grew up with that idea. But I think tracing back to these histories allows us to understand like how the present is shaped by means of like these extractive practices. And I think Sofia does an excellent job connecting the past and the future in that sense, and just not like offering archival materials, but also putting them into context with current works. And I think the process was very straightforward because I really, I've been developing a professional conversation with Sofia for a long time. I'm thinking about new projects with her, and I try to do so with, I think, the more emerging artists of the show. She would be, we would have this rapport in which we would discuss I think the conceptual framework for the piece, and then she would like offer, I guess, material proposals and solutions for what the show that we would be included in the show, and then I would comment on that and assist the creation of the work, and then I have to place it in context with other works. So thinking about archival materials, also in that photo that you see now on the screen, it's connected to Beatriz Santiago Muñoz's work, Pharmacopoeia, that is I think it's a 2012 film, in relation to land modification and the transformation of species in Puerto Rico for aesthetic purposes for tourism, and how it transformed the cultural landscape and erases a lot of cultural practices in the island connected to the plants that were destroyed for making space for these like new idealized tropical landscape. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to do in the show, is just like draw connections between these emerging artists who have very fascinating archival practices, and many contemporary artists that are in different stages of their careers who are dealing with these topics in different ways. Yeah.
And speaking of iteration, like working with artists or working with an exhibition over time, I mean, we talked a lot about during the weeks of how each institution, the show changes depending on the layout and working with the host curator, and also that's like an education for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So with our, could you talk about how you've learned more about this show as it's been traveling?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's something that I've been really considering now, because the show has been traveling for quite some time, and I have the opportunity to develop the show originally in 2018, but I only saw the first iteration in 2020, and then it was closed for a while because of the pandemic. So it was in storage somewhere in Connecticut for more than 2 years. So we had to stop traveling the show. And it allowed me to think more profoundly about the connections that I was trying to draw from the way that the artists were laid out in the exhibition space. So I think the first iteration, which was the previous picture that you saw, that was one out of 5 rooms. There was plenty of space to showcase the work in the way that you would display exhibitions or artworks that are like more prone to be installed in a way that it kind of highlights their aesthetic qualities, you know, like as you would do with, you know, like very rich or even more so like minimalist sculpture. So I think the space and a, you know, like a void container in that way kind of becomes more important for that kind of work. And I think that was a very comfortable installation situation. But then I think whenever the show travels and I need to rely on the curators that really know the space, like Brian, for creating a different layout that will bring about different kinds of densities to the show, that will bring also like new relationships between the works, because the works will not live in the same configurations as they were originally designed. Then it allows me to see what other connections were created, or what other dialogues or narratives or utterances are done by the exhibition by means of what I think narratively as walking through the show. Mm-hmm. And I think this exhibition at the MOS, I think it does a great job in concentrating, and I feel this density of works that are all in dialogue, like really brings to the forefront, I think, a couple of specific conceptual threads that I want to work in, that the show is trying to develop. So in that other iteration, for example, what happened with Beatriz Santiago Muñoz's work is that it's kind of put in context with Sofia's work, but now it lives in its own space, and this is for installation reasons merely, because you need, you know, darker space to project a video, simple as that. But that also kind of prevents other kinds of reading, and I like how fluid the space is in these two galleries, how the show is currently installed, because I can see some connections that were kind of repeated and iterated and intensified by how the show was put together in different locations. So if you go to any other slide for that show, you will see that, well, that's I think that's kind of an exception to all of those other installations, but you will see that there's always the presence of some other artists, such as Reyes Santiago Rojas, who does I think the sugar cane sticks that are done with soda cans. That also creates a connection between Sofia's work and, you know, I think the larger worldwide economic trade systems, and how these extractive practices not only take commodities from the Americas, but also kind of like repack it into these new forms and are resold to us. And I think that connection is very intense in those works. And I think, yeah, for example, here they live one next to the other, and you can do that kind of like overlapping reading by means of just like being in the space. And that's very specific to how it's being laid out in this iteration. Yeah.
Yeah, you were talking about how, I mean, first it's when designing the exhibition, I mean, there's always the practical is with Daniel's small excavation work, showing the largest painting that was originally in the Luxor Casino Hotel. There was only one space that it could be, and when laying out the show, there were certain anchors for the spaces. And but you have like several themes or texts of how the groupings
Yeah.
are, and in our current layout, you said there were some different groupings that kind of made you think about things differently, of, for the next iteration.
Yeah, I guess so. I think the current installation does an excellent job bringing to the forefront two specific threads of the exhibition, which are the idea of critical museography and how many artists use the display device and in a critical way to create different understandings of what we call heritage, or how we create importance for a specific materiality that it's not necessarily previously understood as important in the frameworks of art or archaeology, for example, talking about Daniel's work. Yeah, and I think that's a work that really works as an anchor, because it's massive, and we usually work at university museums that are the institutions that are mostly interested in the show because of its, I guess, its density in terms of archive and discourse. So that's for a specific kind of audience I've been realizing more and more. But I think that lives very nicely in this first floor gallery, because it's creating this dialogue with Michael Rakowitz and Alia Farid, and these artists that are also exploring and exploiting the idea of displaying an object in a museum, or just like creating a materiality that needs to live in a museum, and how it kind of like brings this sense of reality to knowledge in different forms. Like it belongs in a museum because it's displayed in this, using these aesthetic procedures that make them worthy of being in a museum, or just like creating it in a certain material makes it interesting for a museum practice. But they're kind of like trying to push those boundaries. And I think the same happens with the insertion and extraction of natural species in the second floor gallery, because they're connecting worldwide trade with colonial extraction, and how these ways of understanding nature and cultures that are not Western culture were instrumentalized for being able to enable these extractive practices. And I think this concentration of works allows for those concepts to be like really intense in the space, and being dialogue amongst them. There's a lot of fiction also in the second floor, so I think all of those concepts kind of like are woven together. So I really like that from the show, so as it is installed right now. So I think I would make the most of that for future iterations. Yeah.
And going back, looking at the archive, looking at collections, the institutions that house these seems to be a common theme or a context, influence in how you organize these works.
Mm-hmm.
The institution itself and where you exhibit.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to talk about, it's like how other iterations of this idea of using the museum, using the buildings themselves to organize your shows, like the iteration or intervention.
Yeah, well, I remember that when I visited one of the classes here at Virginia Tech, I was thinking a lot about the meaning of using institutional languages, and I really like how many artists are using those institutional languages to create these fractures in discourse. However, at the same time, I feel that you can only do as much when you're using those procedures and languages to work within an institution, to be able to fracture, to truly create a meaningful one, at least. So sometimes you have to go beyond, and I think that has been a question that I have explored in many different ways, in many different practices that I have, because I also have a past as an artist. But this project that you're seeing right now came out of the question of what it meant to be an emerging artist in a developing country, when you are allowed to showcase at the largest museum complex in the country. So I was invited to do this survey, in 2017 that was meant to be a small show for emerging artists throughout Colombia. So it was very wide encompassing, but at the same time it was a very small show because you usually get a small room in one of the 5 museums, and you get the room for 3 months because it's a temporary exhibition. So those are the rules, and that's how, like the rules of engagement. But at the same time, it doesn't really allow for like a large presentation, showcase, or promotion of these emerging practices. And I think that's something that I'm really thinking about every time. I think in Never Spoken Again, that's something that I'm repeating all the time. I want to promote the artists that are emerging in the show, like more openly than I do with the ones that are really famous and celebrated already. So with this show that's called Nuevos Nombres, New Names, I did a 2-year exploration of emerging practices in Colombia, and the way that I found that I could really showcase and use the space in the best possible way for presenting these artists, like very, like in the widest possible dissemination form, in consultation and in conversation with the curatorial teams of the museum, was to do a number of interventions and these iteration cycles that we devised for this project to take place. So instead of being stuck 3 months in a small space, while major exhibitions were happening in the larger spaces of the Contemporary Arts Museum, we decided to create this format where they would intervene the architecture of the museum. So that, for example, is on top of what it would be the arts collection of the National Museum. And next to it is, like this European modernist painting collection that everybody visits when they come to the museum. So that's one of the pieces of the show. I can't remember what it's called.
It's a windsock.
The windsock, yeah. That's a massive windsock. Mm-hmm. It looks small from that angle, but it's quite a massive intervention, and it involves liaising with many architects. That are related to the work in the museum for creating that project. And then that's a phone booth. That's a work that is by Carlos Guzman, and it's related to I think the hijack of the storming of the National Justice Palace, or the Supreme Court would be, of Colombia in 1985 by an urban guerrilla called the M19. So all of those works are also dealing with archives as well, and they are dealing with politics, which is also an overarching narrative of many of the works that I do and I curate and I did as an artist as well. So because these interventions were outside the museum and they were in the architecture instead of being showcased in an exhibition page, then we were allowed to have those works showcased for more than 2 years. So I think that that was the longest possible temporary exhibition that happened in the museum, and that is a work by Reyes Santiago Rojas, who is also I don't know if you were going to make a comment about that, but he is connected to the show because he has one piece here called Sugar Crush. That is next to Sophia's, who we discussed, and I have a long-standing relationship with the artist also because it's works that I believe in and want to promote.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about, is working with artists over a long period of time and how the dialogue, the studio visits, it develops, and also just building trust. I mean, a lot of the artists that I've curated over here, I've known for over 10 years.
Right.
And what you can do, like with that next iteration, or what you can do with the next piece. I mean, there's more of a dialogue than if you're meeting somebody for the first time and you're kind of establishing that trust. And that's when we were talking, that was something that the students brought up a lot, was how do you find your artists, or how do you develop the show together?
I think when you're becoming a curator, you start developing these relationships early on with some practitioners that you recognize that have discourse that is has some affinity to your own, And I think the conversations develop in a way that both practices are affected and both discourses are affected, one by the other. I think curatorially, the way that their works have evolved made me think about my own practice very much. And I think it has happened in the other direction as well. So that piece, for example, I really like it because it was another intervention for the same exhibition, but this was a cycle that was devoted to intervening the collections inside the museum. And we installed many of the pieces as if they were part of that collection, so they wouldn't affect the functioning of those permanent exhibitions. But it also made me think about how these trajectories of matter kind of also lay the framework for thinking about criticisms that are not necessarily rooted in ideology, but rather how they are, how we can pursue, like larger intellectual undertakings by means of just examining materiality. And I think those things came from creating the show that you're seeing now and seeing like how they unfolded in space. And I think I also got really interested in museum display and display practices by means of all those interventions. And some of these works, we managed to put them in the permanent collection of the museum. And then I think many of them just stay there, installed. So many of them outlived the exhibition and they've been installed in there for 7 years now. Yeah.
And in the show, I mean, you'll see that there's a lot of didactic text with each of the pieces, and I wanted to ask about like how, writing seems to come first for you when you're writing about ideas to think about an exhibition before, and could you expand on that as like in the context of this show?
Yeah, absolutely. This text that you're seeing on the screen right now, I think it was one of the first rehearsals that I did related to how I think about materiality as a form of critique. And this text, it's called Glamorous Hoarding, and it verses about, it's an experiment about thinking how the museum can be thought of as a hoarder. And it connects this hoarding practice with two case studies, which are two shows dedicated to hoarders. One is a British show and one is an American show, and how display practices and aesthetic operations create the possibility for hoarding to be socially sanctioned. And I talk about how the museums are kind of ever growing in a way that they are always trying to keep investors interested, keep people interested, but that only kind of creates this massive accumulation of architecture and debt and heritage and like culture that lives somewhere in a like in a basement or a storage space facility for museums. So I'm talking about like this as hoarding. And I think that was the first time that I was rehearsing ideas related to what ended up being Never Spoken Again. Because I had, I guess, previous, I would say like non-verbalized ideas or hunches of like what the show was going to be. And I had it like somewhere inside me, but the text became a way of being able to lay out the concepts. And I think in the other show that I just mentioned, some of those ideas were kind of like laid out, but I really want to see, I wanted to create a framework for that specific exploration of material cultures that was not necessarily just artistic intervention, but a bigger intellectual pursuit. Yeah.
And I mean, it seems that you're very comfortable with the group show, and I wanted to like go back to what you mentioned about how you started out as like an artist and the collective, because was your intention to? I mean, your initial intention wasn't to be a curator first.
Yeah. No, I think curating was something that, I mean, it's not like it happens to you. It's not like somebody forced me to be a curator, but I think the way that your career evolves, opens specific pathways and you decide which one to take. And I think one was display practices, exhibition practices, and that was first connected to my practice as a visual artist. So that image that you're looking at was kind of a running joke that I have with my art collective. We call it the pirate machine, and this is an image from 2009 where we're thinking about how to use existing infrastructures for creating meaningful conversations around politics, around history, around perhaps we could even call it archives, and how we engage with different communication practices and different consumption practices that are related not only to media, but also goods, services, and culture. So that, like that kind of pirate machine was kind of a rhetorical device that would allow us to speak about those things in different forms and like open up conceptual avenues for our work. So I work with this art collective for just under 10 years, and I think that that's the first time that I saw, like my work being interested in dealing with existing infrastructures and museums and institutions and being like meta, para, institutional, or just like working inside, outside.
Yeah, it does seem like existing infrastructures,
Yeah.
existing things that you wouldn't normally approach as an artwork, like the same with the telephone booth, the archive, museum languages, things that are existing almost like a ready-made.
Yeah.
And the parrot machine was the first project that you all did as a collective, or I mean,
right. It was more like the way that we kind of consolidated a visual image of the practice that we were carrying it out. But at the same time, we were doing a lot of street intervention, media intervention, practices, performance, what would you would call like artivism? I don't know. I don't really like those terms because I think like some other things are happening and I think they are very historical, trying to frame specific practices in different parts of the world. But we were doing a lot of intervention, just to say, and this is one of them. Instead of participating in a show that we were invited to, we just decided to get rid of the catering service and do a performance and engage in different conversations with the audience that were like really unprepared for that. And yeah, it's just about intervening the languages and like just bringing in to a different level. Yeah.
Did you provide food?
Sorry?
Did you provide food for this performance?
Yes,
okay.
yes, we actually did the catering service.
So did the audience, they believed, this is the whole idea with the skepticism coming in, and these are the origins of your interest in the skepticism of these interventions where everybody's assuming that you are the real caterers.
Yeah, well, you would be tragically surprised to know that some people didn't even recognize some of us. Yeah, and that only speaks to the way that we engage with people who are in the service industry, that I'm also in a different way part of, because I also own food businesses back in Mexico, so I have a different understanding of that now. But it was successful, or tragically successful in the sense that because some of them don't even bother to look at the people who are serving them wine, like we could engage in these interventions, little things that we were just like putting inside the show without being like kind of like called out. Yeah.
And it seems like, is this, could you tell us more, the food service industry, or going into that, there seemed like to be another things of that institution of food service that you were kind of critiquing as this collective. And the catering was the first project attack?
I think so, and I think it was more talking about institutional, the inner workings of institutions and the languages and the, I think, social conventions that are attached to not only displaying and showcasing art, but also engaging with it, and how that kind of self-contained word just created a very limited form of engagement, and we were trying to expand that in different ways. And I think that has been also an overarching topic of, I think, all of my intellectual practice, both as an artist and as a curator. So that project that you have on your screens right now, for example, speaks to that, because we're mimicking or passing to as an institution, public institution dedicated to culture in the city of Bogota. So we were doing like fairs in the streets that would resemble other services provided by similar institutions, but our institution was called something like Institute for Tactical Culture, and it was all about developing frameworks for surviving the city in low-income contexts. So the next slide, for example, so we're all mimicking these institutional languages and procedures, and I think that's, yeah, I can connect that like even to like to my practices today. So for example, that is a way of bargaining with, you know, like a sort of sign language with the, you know, like the incoming bus driver to, you know, like be taken for free or just like getting a discount. So those were the things that we were handing out in this, you know, like sort of like para-institutional spaces. So I think I've been dealing with that language for quite a while already. Yeah.
And then also the language of like humor.
Yeah,
too.
yeah. Humor is absolutely essential. You can, yeah, you can say so many serious things through humor in a way that it's accessible and it kind of like seeps into the social without being, you know, like stopped or like censored. And I think censorship was a big topic, especially in Colombia, where I come from. In the, you know, in the past few governments, it was very complicated to speak about the government until, I guess, I'm gonna say like mid-2010s. So humor was a way that we could kind of relax that structure and be able to convey very critical ideas in a humorous way. So that one, what you're seeing on your screens is I think it's a screenshot from a video that we did in Chile. We were invited to this performance festival, and this work is about sustainability in agriculture, the introduction of GMOs then in the country and in the Americas, and the way that some species were being replaced and they were like forced upon us by means of transnational industrial agricultural practices and through free trade agreements. So we would use humor, we would use music, we would use performance, we would use serious research. So we had like different outputs, text outputs, academic outputs, workshops, but we also did like pop videos, like, you know, like popular music videos. That one was done for a project with the Guggenheim Museum. And then what you're seeing, the poster next to it is also kind of revising archival material to bring it into context with our current research. Because that's kind of like the connection between, you know, like pulp science fiction from the 1930s and then, you know, like the incoming threat of GMOs. Yeah.
And are you still working as an artist collective or as an artist?
Well, not necessarily with the collective. I think at some point in our careers, when we were all going to get our MFAs or MAs, we all left for different cities. So we were spread through Europe, South America, and the United States. So it was very difficult to carry out this practice when we were all separated. And I think we would think about this differently right now, because we already, like as a species now, have this like global learning experience where we know that we can have a distributed practice and the systems are in place for us to do it. However, it was very much connected to our local context. So I think at some point, we kind of decided to break up and like move into different strands of our career, and my career became quite academic, and it became more related to curating. So I started curating by means of putting together shows for my collective. We originally didn't want to create any materiality to be left behind or as something that could be collected, something that could be purchased or traded. So everything was either free, or we kind of like open sourced all of the materials that we were developing for our interventions. But then we didn't really know how to put a show together. So somebody had to, you know, like figure that out, and I started thinking about displaying practices, and that kind of took me to develop an interest in curating, and eventually I started doing, you know, like courses and residencies related to curation, and yeah, that took me to starting doing shows. Yeah.
And what's coming up next?
What's coming up next? I am doing a number of different small-scale research projects related to museum practices, material culture, plants, just like in the show, but I think the show serves as a big framework for pursuing these intellectual projects further. So I think the show has a lot of information and it's packed with potential ideas for the future. But I would love to see these ideas like fully laid out and developed, and that's what I'm trying to do right now. So I'm writing a few chapters of a book, and I'm developing each chapter through different research that I do either with museums, basically right now in Mexico and in Colombia, and we're also beginning work with the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh, and I'm also working with some artists, starting with studying the materiality that they're interested in, and kind of like tracing the entire ecology and history of those materialities, both materially, historically, and also conceptually. Like how, you know, like through the different understanding of our knowledge forms and the reconsideration of other epistemologies, they kind of come back to us in a different way, and how these artists are enabling that content to like really come back to us. So for example, Adobe. So we thought of Adobe as a minor architectural practice because it was an indigenous practice. But now that we understand climate change and everything, we know that Adobe is very resistant, and we know that Adobe is very generous in terms of weather and climate control and humidity control. So now it's become a fashionable thing to do for architects. So I'm kind of like tracing those metabolisms that come from reconsidering concepts and histories and theories of knowledge that were previously discarded. And I'm doing that through this, you know, like book exploration. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, David. I really appreciate you coming here and sharing the show with us, and also, you know, your trajectory in your career.
Thank you. Thank you for this, you know, this very generous spaces.
And we have a couple minutes for any questions from the audience, if anybody has one. All the way in the back, Braden.
Networks, but like artifacts are kind of ostensibly presented by museums as like dead, like no longer active social participants.
Yeah.
I think like so much of the time, curators kind of like fall into they're more like interior designers. So like a curator at the MoMA is trying to kind of curate the experience of seeing modern art or something like that. I guess like what do you see your responsibility as a curator? You kind of touched on it like very briefly, but your responsibility as a curator to really kind of like fracture, like shape the foundations of the institutions that you're working in. And then like, I guess like what you're saying, like then metabolizing those institutions to kind of like have different sorts of conversations.
Well, I think the artists that I'm working with, they do a very nice job highlighting those problems with the current institutional practices. So I guess what I'm trying to do is to create the frameworks for them to be able to speak very profusely about these things. So there's a work in the show by Ulrich Lopez that is called Summon Song, and it talks about how when you take these objects from their original context and you put them in vitrines, you kind of destroy them because they have a social purpose, and they also have a physical form of activation, which is through using human voice. So when you put it inside a vitrine, you kind of destroy the possibility for that object to, you know, partake in a social space. So I guess I think I kind of touch on that also by means of talking about how much can you do when you're using the institutional frameworks and languages. So I'm always in the process of imagining what other things can I do, because I don't believe that being completely inside or outside an institution are meaningful spaces for enabling change. So I think as much as I am like touching upon both sides, and I kind of like create the languages for these things to be able to be in conversation, I'm kind of servicing to critical practices that are already in place, that are already looking into this. And I think in a different presentation, I talked about the work of Shimrit Lee. She talks about the colonizing museums, and I remember that it was very interesting to me that she was not after like this book that became you know, like quite spoken about. She just moved into the private sector, designing experiences for kids. And I was like, no, this is the, you know, like one of the people that needs to remain in this site to create fractures in the system. But that kind of also speaks to the way that the system is created. So maybe what you need to do as a cultural practitioner of sorts is develop new frameworks. I like the idea of activating existing infrastructures and transforming them because they're going to be there anyways. I mean, our museums are going to be there, they're just growing. So what can we do with them that is meaningful and transform them into something that really services a community? That's something that really interests me. So I love the idea of the cultural center instead of the museum, for example. And I think there have been very meaningful practices that touch upon that, for such as the way that the cultural center of Sao Paulo was developed and envisioned by, what's his name? The name is escaping me right now, but there's this curator that is based at the University of Sao Paulo that kind of created that framework for people to understand that the museum is their space. The communities didn't need it to be related to art languages to be able to enter the space and use it for their own purposes. I think the Anahuacalli Museum, for example, in Mexico City is doing an excellent job in that sense, because they are allowing what we would call, like in these academic spaces, the vernacular, to enter the museum space. So there's this ritual in Mexico that is called the Altar de Muertos. This is a shrine to the dead. That when you live in Mexico, and if you like that, we all end up doing one, right? And these shrines are devoted to your dead people. So I'm gonna put one for my my grandmother who recently passed. And you put it, you know, a number of foods and objects related to her life, to celebrate her life and allowing, you know, like a better passage towards death. They say that they come and say hi to you by means of you putting the shrine in. So there's like this big altar that they do in the Anahuacalli Museum, and that's the only time when the people from the neighborhood of an area in the south of Mexico City, that's the only time that they come into the museum. So I like those spaces because they actually are a service for the communities. Yeah. Yeah.
I have kind of a related question, which is you're talking about how you have this vision and you see, you're looking at trying to present a message and bringing things in from all over the place. But it eventually is going to get to an audience. So what part of your process is how to incorporate? I mean, how much of that process is thinking about the audience rather than what I want to tell versus how it's going to be taken in by people? Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I think this very iteration of Never Spoken Again is a great way to think about this, because I have ideas for that I developed, I baked into the show. So one of them is, for example, creating like this myth of the parrot to create a skepticism about what you're going to find in the show, but I also created like this texts that are not necessarily traditional curatorial texts that you will find in the exhibition. They're mashups and creative writing exercises that incorporate scientific gossip, historical narrations, and also cinema theory. And they have blank spaces for you to complete this. Basically, you know, like nouns, what you need to put in there. But you're kind of completing them with your own understanding of culture and whatever you like your background is, right? So sometimes you will see the text and you'll be like, oh, I know who he's talking about. But sometimes you won't know, or you will put something else. And the idea is just to bring both skepticism, but also like the possibility of you to complete the narrative and be involved in the process of meaning creation. And that's what I'm trying to bring into the show. And I say that this iteration is it's important for me in that sense because of the way that this micro-residency was conceived for me, I've been able to really discuss these ideas and see how much of that is transpiring. Because many times, because this is a traveling show, I have conceived public programs and things like that, but COVID, and then some other times I couldn't travel to see the show because the show is just installed around the country. And I think I'm very glad that I was able to see the material results here because of what it ended up being, but also because I ended up having actual conversations about the things that are happening in the show, problematizing things and seeing how effective they are. And I think that only happened through the engagement with the community. Yeah. So, yeah.
We just have time for one more question. Meredith?
I love the title, and it's irony and playfulness, but bitterness too. It seems like that throughout your work. And so I was wondering what it is in Spanish, and if you could talk about that. But also the owl that was found. Talk about that story, which just I wanted to laugh, but then I was also so sad. And
yeah, Never Spoken Again is basically kind of giving away a little bit of the story, the origin story for the exhibition, which is I see this parrot in the Museum for Natural History in Berlin, and in the context of a curatorial visit, and they're telling us these fantastic stories about the parrot and how it came into the hands of the museum. But it was originally the parrot, they say, of Alexander von Humboldt, this famous explorer of the Americas that devised many scientific measuring systems and so on. But all of those are myths. Like, we don't really know what happened with the bird. We don't really know how it got into the hands of Humboldt, or like if anything that is being said about that story is true, because basically it's not part of history. It's not official sanctioned history. So I was kind of taken by that, like thinking about how we decided maybe, like back in 17th century, 18th century, 19th centuries, how scientific knowledge was canonized as such, and something was kind of left behind as scientific gossip or something that just doesn't comply to our scientific standards. Which, like if you know about science, sometimes we develop frameworks, and whatever doesn't kind of fulfill the rules that we created for that scientific framework, we just leave behind, right? That it's not, because it's kind of ruining the possibility of us capturing reality or whatever. And I was taken by that, but I also, through the visit, through the Natural History Museum, there was also another exhibition dealing with science. And I think everybody was fascinated with the ideas that were there, but I was kind of really shocked with all the violence that was attached to all these extractive practices that allow for these things to be in the museum. And I think that violence was obscured by the curatorial narrative. So I wanted to bring that back into the forefront. So that's why I'm interested in that story and then the practices that are in the exhibition. And I think that's playing with the humor, the irony, the skepticism. I don't know about bitterness, but at least give the opportunity to these stories to be considered alongside other like more officially sanctioned discourse practices of science and museum collections and so on. Yeah. But the owl belongs to Daniel Small. The owl is part of the mythology of that excavation piece, and it's kind of in the culture that was created of that archaeological, non-archaeological site. So there are many objects that belong to this film set that was destroyed that looks like the city of Luxor in ancient Egypt for the Ten Commandments, but there are also other objects that are kind of developed around the culture of that excavation site that I think they are connecting like pop culture and like narratives and blending them together in like this fake excavation. But you have friezes from the Luxor, you have paintings from the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, and it's all about how value is created. And I think that I can't remember exactly where the owl comes from, but I think it was buried in the desert as well because it's also filled with sand. And it's all about that mythology, how it's created. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, David. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And this exhibition will be on view until December 14th. And every second Thursday, I will be leading a public tour at noon. All right, thank you.